Welcome back, werewolves. Today we're going to be talking about preparing tea over the different dynasties and how it changed. If you're new to the channel, we're always talking about tea, more specifically Gongfu tea, and how we got to this exquisite style of tea, from ancient times to its modern practice in Gongfu tea. Today's actually a really cool one because we're going through the preparation from all the way back in 280 in the 6 dynasties to modern day Gongfu. Now, if you like any of the teaware you see in the video, feel free to go check them out in our shop. And if you like any of our merch, like this t-shirt here, make sure you subscribe. And again, you can find it on our website. All right, so let's get into talking about the progression to Gongfu. Starting in 200 AD, we get the first kind of notable points that we really want to talk about. And the first one is Wang Bao mentioning drinking tea with teaware. And this is again about 200 AD. We're also getting the first sites of the which is what Lu Yu talks about in the Classic of Tea as his favorite type of tea. If you don't know who Lu Yu is, well, he's a pretty cool character. He's known for writing the original book on tea, the Classic of Tea. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But really, he was a poet, he was an artist, very similar to, our modern day, or I guess medieval Renaissance man. That's what a lot of these people in China were in the early Tang dynasty. He's a really cool character. We know him for tea, but he was actually famous for other things and just happened to write a book on tea, which people really loved, and it was the first one of its kind. And it was very detailed too. So he's a really cool guy, really cool Renaissance man. I definitely can relate to him in a lot of ways, but he's a cool character. So we'll circle back to him. So Lu Yu is a really cool character. So let's get into the Tang dynasty when he lived and talk about that. So the Tang dynasty again is roughly from 700 to 900, 907 AD. So we are into, common times right now. And tea was just starting to be used less like an herbal medicine and more like a beverage. But you gotta remember, tea was originally just like any other herbal medicine. It was used in the same way in Chinese traditional medicine. So it's cool, but it has this lineage and progression to it from medicine originally. Some people will claim medicinal benefits to tea. I'm not claiming any of that here. That's where we start to see our transition to modern day tea. Now, back then, they were boiling tea. And there were many, many pieces of equipment, epiquage, as Lu Yu says in the Classic of Tea, that were needed, and it was really something only for the elite. You didn't really see it for common day peasants and practitioners. In a lot of cases, tea was given as a tribute to the emperor, which is really interesting. And we'll see this throughout tea history, the trickle-down effect of tea and teaware culture as we progress from the Tang to the Ming dynasty. This boiled style of tea was very rudimentary, and as we'll see, China moves on. Once they get to a new dynasty, and it's not exactly cut and dry perfectly, but basically once we move on to a new dynasty, they kind of move on until a new type of tea until we get to modern day loose leaf tea. Once we get out of the Tang dynasty, most people in China stop drinking this boiled tea and move on to something else. We see the first known tea bricks in the Tang dynasty. Now these aren't like tea bricks that we would see today. They were still tea that you would boil and it would break down. This would be considered a very low grade tea by today's standards, even though it carried over in Russia for several centuries after China stopped drinking it and was exported into Russia, which is pretty cool. But these bricks are differentiated from the loose leaf bricks we see today. So what are loose leaf bricks versus the original boiled bricks? So the loose leaf bricks were still maintaining the whole leaf and then compacting and pressing it. So there are slight variations in thickness, almost like a perforation, so you can break off a piece of tea, drop it in, it will expand out, and you haven't broken that many leaves. In the Tang dynasty, they were still scenting these with camphor wood, right? Because they weren't exactly the most tasty thing by themselves, so they scented them with camphor wood and other things to get the flavor that they were looking for. Additionally, they had these embossed or pressed stamps in the tea, which is kind of cool, is the origin to what we see today in these small little papers that are put in tea cakes. And so what these are for is, one, to show authenticity, but two, they just look cool, right? And so we see the same thing in modern day loose leaf tea cakes, where they will put a small square, it's typically 1.5 by 1.5 inches, and they put it in the back of the tea cake so you can see their name on it, the type of tea, and that maintains its integrity, helps you tell when it was pressed and made and things like that. So for each of these sections, we're going to talk about a notable tea book and notable tea wear implications. So first, for the tea book, obviously I've already said it before, so I'm not going to beat a dead horse with it. Lu Yu's Classic of Tea was written in the Tang Dynasty, the first ever book on tea, period. And he covers pretty much everything. How to prepare tea, how to go through and pick teas if you're picking teas, what types of teaware you need, the lineage and different best teas in different area, the best type of teaware that you can possibly get, minor styles of teaware that you can also get that he doesn't think are as nice but are still valuable. And he goes through this in a very, very systematic way. A lot of the other books are additions or just small fragments, but this is the first and one of the only comprehensive books that we really get from 1,000 years ago. He died in 804, so I mean, it's like 1,200 years ago we're talking about that he wrote this book, which is really, really cool. And then finally we have the notable teaware from the time. As Lu Yu mentions in the Classic of Tea, he talks about this. Well, not exactly this. The predecessor to this, the yueware, which is the predecessor to this. So yueware is a type of celadon. Now, originally, celadons were a gray, a light gray, or a dark gray color. It wasn't until they progressed along that we started to see this green, but this is what we think of, and this is why we call ours the jade glaze, because it reminds us, and we didn't come up with this, right? The jade connection goes all the way back in China for several hundred years. But that's why we call it the jade glaze, because it's absolutely beautiful and it looks like jade, or more specifically, jadeite. Next, we have Song Dynasty preparation of tea. So this is the first time that we see powdered tea in China, and very similarly to the bricked and boiled tea, we only see it in this dynasty. It transitions and progresses and develops into its own thing in Japan, but this is the only dynasty where they really drink powdered tea heavily in China. Now, because of this powdered tea, we're going to talk about the teaware that's most suitable for that. But there's a ton of things going on in the Song Dynasty for tea and tea preparation. So first of all, we have the first douchas, which are tea competitions, which is widely accepted and loved by the people in China. This is also where we start to see the transition from tea as utility to tea and teaware for collection purposes, for collectors, right? And that's because it becomes more accessible. Boiling tea, very hard, very complicated. Powdered tea, slightly less so, right? I mean, there's still a ceremonial aspect to it, and in these tea competitions, it wasn't just the tea itself, but the way that it was prepared by the master. So don't get me wrong, it was still complicated, but it was spreading across China and becoming less complicated as more people grew familiar with the type of tea. At this point in Chinese history, serving tea to all your guests became common. And we see this in modern tea, even in business culture today, where when you go to a business meeting in China, right, there'll be a circle table with 8 chairs, and typically there'll be tea served before you get into the alcohol and all the other drinks you're going to be drinking for the night. There'll typically be some tea or a glass ready for you to put in tea and get ready to go. When I lived in China, I lived in Yangzhou, and in Yangzhou we loved green tea, so it was always green tea in Yangzhou. Next thing we have is the Chama Gu Dao. This is the tea road, right? The road of tea. This is where we start to see the exchange of cultures, and China starting to expand out and other people starting to learn more about tea. And again, they were typically a dynasty behind what China was doing. So when China was exporting boiled teas, they were drinking powdered teas. When China was exporting powdered teas, they were drinking loose leaf teas. But we start to see the first tea cakes. Tea cakes were a quintessential piece in China being able to establish itself as a power in the East and have leverage for trading. It was the good to trade with China. In fact, horses were traded for tea. Silver was traded. Think of this. For its weight, 2 grams of silver would get you 3 grams of tea. It was almost as valuable as silver. Absolutely crazy. Can you believe it? Could you imagine going in somewhere with just this little like dime of tea and being like, okay, well, this is 5 grams. This is equal to, a couple $100. No, that's crazy. I literally couldn't imagine it. Like, I could not imagine being in a time where tea was worth as much as silver. or a horse. But compressing these tea into tea cakes is what made it feasible, because then you can get the same weight of tea in a much smaller space. Same reason we see tea cakes today, right? Again, this is for powdered tea though, not loose leaf tea cakes. So don't confuse them. It's kind of weird because again, we do have these tea bricks and tea cakes, but they're different than what we see today for each of those. As for notable books for this, we're gonna see Cai Shang's Record of Tea. And then for notable tea wares, this is where I really wanna hit, specifically because they were doing the tea contests and because we were doing powdered tea. The start of the Zhenjian, or the metallic glaze, became very, very popular. So why was this style really popular? It's because of the contrast, right? So when Lu Yu was talking about the Yue ware, it wasn't this dark green color like the celadon sitting behind me, it was the light gray. And so it contrasted the dark of the liqueur of the tea very well. And it's the same thing with the metallic glaze, where because mainly we were talking about powdered teas, the white or green foam from making the powdered tea is absolutely beautiful in it. Speaking of which, if you like Japanese green teas, if you drink matcha and you make it, you got to get a metallic glaze cup. It looks absolutely gorgeous. I can't even, it looks so good. You have to see it for yourself. You have to check it out. Absolutely beautiful. Then we have the 5 famous kilns in the Song dynasty. Now I'm not gonna go over each of those today because they're not really important for the preparation of tea in its time. The reason that they came about though was because of the development of tea culture. And because of the development of tea culture, there were all these sprouts that pulled away and made tea more interesting and accessible, like I said, which led to these different styles coming into fruition. Lastly, we have the Ming dynasty. Now, if you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I love talking about this guy, Emperor Zhu Yuan Zhang. Why do we care about him? He said, in order for it to be a tribute, it must be loose leaf. Boiled tea, psh, gone. Powdered tea, psh, gone. There is controversy on whether he was a tea snob and he thought that loose leaf tasted the best, or if he was more of a simplist or minimalist and just kind of was like, nope, I just want this, and there wasn't necessarily a reason, just wanting to streamline the tea process. Either way, it doesn't really matter. We see the start of the 2 most famous players in all of Chinese teaware today. Jing Dezhen for porcelain and Yixing for stoneware. So for Jing Dezhen, this is one of their most common styles, right? We have the Qinghua porcelain, the blue and white painted. We call this blue painted because we think blue and white porcelain is a little bit misleading because it's not blue and white, right? It's white with a blue underglaze and then a clear overglaze. But this is one of the most notable styles of porcelain from Jing Dezhen. And the thing with Jing Dezhen is they produce many different types of pottery, not just porcelain. These cups actually, so this is not porcelain, but this is from Jing Dezhen as well. And they produce many pieces of absolutely gorgeous pottery, but they became world famous because of their porcelain. And that's because of their exports, because the emperors all got their teaware from Jing Dezhen. When an emperor died and a new one came in, guess who they commissioned to make their teaware? Jing Dezhen. And every single time an emperor died, they did this. Like, they could not use the same teaware as the previous emperor. So it's cool because there's a time period in China where we actually see these notations on the bottom of the cups and mugs and things like that. Jing Dezhen is known for its porcelain, but again, they produce tons of other things. For Yixing, if you've never seen an Yixing pot, this is what they're most notable for, the purple sand variant clays, the zisha, or this is the most popular, the zini. There's 3 main types of clay coming out of Yixing, but the loose leaf style tea really paired well with Yixing. Powdered tea would be absolutely terrible with an Yixing teapot. Absolutely terrible. Like, would not make any sense whatsoever. I would never brew really green tea, but I would definitely never brew powdered green teas in this. It would be just a terrible idea. It wouldn't make any sense. So because of loose leaf tea, making or powing, right, steeping the tea became very accessible to all. Now, the production process of tea, that has become not necessarily more complicated, but more nuanced over time since we get this in the Ming Dynasty about 600-700 years ago now. And because it became easier to steep, it became more accessible. And because it became more accessible, it carried on. And so really, the tradition that we use today for Gongfu style tea comes from 500 to 700 years ago. And we'll talk about some specifics here in just a second. So for the books coming out of the Ming Dynasty, it's kind of weird. They have the same name. We have the 2 cha pus. One is written by Gu Yuanqing and the other one is written by Ju Quan. The former, he talks about, we don't he cha, we don't drink tea, right? We ping cha, we sip tea. And then Juquan talks about white tea being the best and charcoal roasting for your pot, making sure you're using charcoal and roasting it for your kettle is the best way. So those are some pointers that I think a lot of people could still subscribe to today that really come from, back in the Ming Dynasty. But now for, I think, the question that everyone is most excited about. Where did Gongfu style tea specifically come from? So when I'm brewing with my brew cup and my pour cup and my cup, and where did this come from? Well, spoiler alert, it comes from same place as a lot of things in tea culture, Fujian province in China. But the gaiwan, or the brew cup, comes from Sichuan. So they do come from different regions, but they come together in the making of Gongfu tea. And you'll see in a lot of cases where they talk about in Chinese culture what you need for Gongfu style tea, they reference needing an Yixing teapot or a purple clay teapot. They don't necessarily say that you need to have a gaiwan like this one, but this has much more utility. This is for more specific teas. Not necessarily every tea is going to be good in this, where you can brew any tea in a gaiwan, and it's much easier to pour. The steep time, I would definitely recommend, if you don't have any Gongfu style teaware, make sure you get a brew cup before you get a stoneware teapot, because the stoneware teapots, every different region has different characteristics. Yixing, Chaozhou, Jianshui, Nixing, Qinzhou, they all have different characteristics. So I would definitely recommend a brew cup over a Chinese teapot for your first brewing vessel if you've never brewed Gongfu style before. Thanks for hanging out with me and talking about tea preparation today. That's all I have. I got one last sip of tea and then we are off.